George Patton had not moved when he did. The 101st Airborne Division would not simply have been captured, marched into captivity, and written up as prisoners of war. They would have been erased from history, not surrendered, not broken, but wiped out completely. In the frozen darkness of December 1944, the Screaming Eagles were encircled in a small Belgian town most Americans could not even pronounce, let alone find on a map. That town was Bastogne, and inside its perimeter, the defenders were low on ammunition, out of medical supplies, and nearly out of time. German tanks pressed in from every direction because Adolf Hitler himself had ordered their complete destruction, not their capture. The weather was so vicious that Allied aircraft sat useless on icy runways, meaning there were no airdrops, no fighter bomber strikes, and absolutely no help coming from the skies. Every rational assessment said no one could reach them in time because every calculation pointed to the same grim conclusion. The 101st Airborne Division was doomed, and everyone accepted that reality. Everyone, that is, except one man, for this is the moment when Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Western Europe, realized that George S. Patton might be the only general who could pull off the maneuver needed to save the war's most fragile point. This is the story of what he said when Patton actually did it, a story of impossible odds, desperate men in snow-filled foxholes, and a single phone call that carried 10,000 lives in the space of 4 short words. The clock started ticking relentlessly on the 19th of December, 1944, inside the Situation Room at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, where the atmosphere was as heavy as the winter sky outside. Maps covered the walls and tables, but their neat lines and colored pins had suddenly transformed into a nightmare of shifting arrows and unexpected gaps. German forces had smashed into the Ardennes forest days earlier, punching a deep, jagged bulge in the American front that shattered the calm of the sector. Entire units had been pushed back, overrun, or simply vanished in the confusion of the onslaught. But it was Bastogne, a crossroads town that had been a backwater mere days before, that now dominated every conversation and terrified the strategists. Intelligence officers delivered their reports in low, precise voices, stating that the 101st Airborne Division, along with fragments of armor and infantry from other units, was completely encircled in and around Bastogne. There were 10,000 American soldiers surrounded by German formations that outnumbered them several to one. The logistical situation was a catastrophe. Artillery ammunition was restricted, rifle rounds were being rationed, medical stocks were nearly exhausted, and wounded men were lying in freezing basements and barns with no bandages, no morphine, and no heat. German attacks were increasing in intensity, and above it all hung the same brutal sentence: the weather has grounded Allied aircraft. Eisenhower stood before the map, his face lined with fatigue, having been awake more than asleep since the offensive began. The men briefing him could see how much every report weighed on him as he listened without interrupting, hands folded, eyes fixed on the bulge that now clawed westward from the German border. When the summary of Bastogne's situation ended, he asked the only question that mattered: how long can they hold? The intelligence officer hesitated, knowing that his answer would not just be information, but a death sentence. Finally, he replied, "Sir, realistically, 4 or 5 days, maybe a week if everything goes their way." The implication was horrific. After that week, they would be out of ammunition, out of supplies, and the Germans would overwhelm them. Eisenhower's jaw tightened because losing an entire airborne division would be a disaster on any scorecard. Militarily, it would remove a key elite formation. Logistically, it would complicate the defense of the entire sector. But psychologically, it would be devastating because these were not anonymous units. These were the men who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, who had fought through the hedgerows and the streets of Dutch towns during Operation Market Garden. They had become living symbols of American courage, and their annihilation would echo far beyond the frozen woods of Belgium. "What options do we have to relieve them?" Eisenhower demanded, but the answers were bleak. British forces under Bernard Montgomery were containing the northern shoulder of the German advance, but they were not positioned to drive south quickly. Other American armies were engaged in desperate defensive fights just to hold their own lines, and nobody had the troops, the fuel, and the position to launch a major counterattack toward Bastogne on a timeline that matched the grim countdown of the 101st remaining ammunition. Nobody, that is, except Third Army, far to the south, currently engaged in operations in the Saar region. To move on Bastogne, that entire army would need to disengage from its current fronts, pivot north, and drive through winter storms into the teeth of German forces. That meant one name, Patton. For years, Eisenhower had balanced Patton's brilliance against his volatility, knowing the same man who could envision and execute daring maneuvers could also ignite political fires with a single sentence or impulsive gesture. Eisenhower had reprimanded him, defended him, shielded him, and seriously considered firing him more than once because commanding George Patton was like trying to harness lightning. It was exhausting. But now, staring at the map pinned with grim black lines around Bastogne, Eisenhower knew he did not need a polite, easily managed general. He needed lightning. "Get me Patton," Eisenhower ordered. "Tell him I want him in Verdun tomorrow for an emergency conference and tell him to bring plans for offensive operations." He paused, then added quietly, "He'll know what that means." After his staff hurried off, Eisenhower remained alone for a moment in the dim situation room. His aide, Harry Butcher, later recorded that he heard Eisenhower murmur under his breath, speaking not as a distant commander, but as a man pleading with a dangerous ally. "George, for once in this damned war, do exactly what I need you to do. Those paratroopers are counting on you. America is counting on you. I am counting on you." Eisenhower whispered to the empty room, "Do not let me down." The following day, the 19th of December, the meeting at Verdun would become part of legend. A moment historians would retell when Patton shocked the room with a promise that seemed impossible. But often overlooked is how Eisenhower responded, what he said, and how much was truly at stake. The headquarters at Verdun buzzed with officers, couriers, and staff, but the atmosphere in the main conference room was taut and brittle. Around the table sat the men responsible for the Western Front, generals who commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had carried the Allied armies from Normandy to the edges of Germany. Eisenhower opened with a statement more about psychology than maps, telling them that the situation must be seen as an opportunity, not a disaster, putting on a brave face despite the crushing reality. Everyone present knew they were facing the most serious crisis since the morning of the 6th of June, 1944. Then Eisenhower laid out the core problem. The German offensive had cut into the Allied front, creating a vulnerable bulge, but it had also exposed German flanks to counterattack if the Allies could move quickly. Bastogne, sitting at the center of the road network, had to be held because if it fell, the Germans could drive deeper, splitting the Allied front. If it survived, however, the bulge could become a trap. "I want each of you," Eisenhower said, "to think carefully before answering. How soon can you launch an offensive to relieve Bastogne?" Most commanders began mentally calculating numbers, divisions available, roads, fuel stocks, ammunition, estimating how long it would take to pull units out of line and redeploy. It was a question of days, perhaps weeks, and no one wanted to promise more than could be delivered. Then George Patton spoke. "I can attack on the 22nd, he said with 3 divisions. The room went still, eyes turned toward him, and some officers assumed he was bluffing, making an impossible boast to grab attention. To disengage troops from active contact, reorient an entire army 90 degrees, and drive roughly 100 miles through snow and ice to strike the side of a German offensive in 3 days was, by any conventional standard, fantasy. Eisenhower did not smile. He fixed his gaze on Patton and spoke slowly, every word heavy. "George, I am not asking for optimism. I am not asking what might be theoretically possible on a map. I am asking what you can actually accomplish. Truly, the lives of 10,000 American soldiers depend on your answer," Eisenhower pressed. "The men of the 101st Airborne are surrounded, outnumbered, running out of everything. If you say you will be there, and you are not, they die. All of them. I will ask again. Can you attack on the 22nd of December? Patton did not back down. "Ike," he replied, "I already have 3 plans. My staff has anticipated this possibility. We have war-gamed 3 separate contingencies for turning north. On the 22nd, my 4th Armored Division will be attacking toward Bastogne. That is not a guess. It is not a hope. It is a fact." Eisenhower searched his face for signs of bluff or bravado, but instead he saw something rarer in Patton, complete hard-edged certainty. Against all odds, the mercurial general had prepared for exactly this moment. "Very well, George," Eisenhower said at last. "You have your mission. Relieve Bastogne. You have full operational freedom to execute as you see fit." Then his tone changed, and the room felt the temperature drop. "But understand this. If you fail, if those paratroopers die because you did not deliver what you promised, I will personally see that you never command troops again. Not just relieved from Third Army. Finished. Am I clear?" Eisenhower asked with lethal seriousness. "Crystal clear, sir," Patton answered. "I will not fail." Later, Eisenhower pulled his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, aside, and Smith's notes preserved the moment. "The boss asked me if I thought George could really do it," Smith wrote. "I told him it sounded impossible." Ike replied with a grim certainty, "That is why I am sending Patton. Impossible is what he does." What followed from the 20th through the 26th of December was on paper a series of movements and engagements, but in reality, it was a race against a merciless clock. While Patton's staff frantically issued orders, rerouted traffic, reorganized supply lines, and turned entire divisions around in snow-clogged roads, Eisenhower watched Bastogne from afar, living hour to hour on scraps of news. The reports that came into Supreme Headquarters were grim, painting a picture of a siege that was tightening like a noose around the neck of the 101st Airborne Artillery, pounded at American positions day and night, shaking the frozen earth and shattering the nerves of men who had not slept in days. German infantry pressed closer, supported by heavy armor that prowled the perimeter like wolves. While inside the town, ammunition dwindled with each fire mission until commanders were forced to make impossible choices about which targets to engage and which to ignore. Medical officers, their hands stained and freezing, begged for dressings, morphine, and blankets. But the cupboards were bare, leaving wounded men to suffer in the biting cold of unheated basements. Amidst this collapsing situation, the German commander saw an opportunity to end the battle without further bloodshed and sent a written demand to the 101st Acting Commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, calling for immediate surrender or total annihilation. McAuliffe, a man of few words and immense grit, read the pompous demand and scribbled a one-word reply that would echo through military history. Nuts. It was a moment of defiant absurdity in the face of death, a refusal to acknowledge the logic of defeat even when staring down the barrel of a gun. When Eisenhower read that report hundreds of miles away, a weary smile flickered across his face for the first time in days. "At least their spirit is not broken," Eisenhower told his staff, clutching the report as a lifeline of hope. But he knew better than anyone that spirit alone could not stop 88mm shells or Tiger tanks. They needed armor, they needed ammo, and above all, they needed Patton to get there. On the 22nd of December, as promised, elements of the Third Army began their attack northward, slamming into the German flank with the ferocity of a sledgehammer. But the map was not the territory, and they ran into everything the winter and the Wehrmacht could throw at them. The roads were sheets of ice that sent tanks sliding into ditches. Bridges were blown by retreating German units. And every village seemed to house a dug-in anti-tank gun waiting to ambush the advancing columns. The advance was agonizingly slower than anyone had hoped, measuring progress in yards rather than miles. At Bastogne, the situation tightened further as units found themselves down to a handful of rounds per rifle, forcing men to fix bayonets and prepare for close-quarters combat. Some artillery batteries had so little ammunition that every single shot had to be weighed and debated as if the shells were made of solid gold. Wounded men lay 2 and 3 to a stretcher, or on the cold floor, or simply on the bare earth, their breath misting in the freezing air as life slowly drained out of them. Frostbitten sentries stared out into the blowing snow, eyes burning from the cold, knowing that somewhere beyond that white curtain, more German troops were massing for yet another assault intended to wipe them off the map. Eisenhower sent a desperate message to McAuliffe. "Hold at all costs. Relief is on the way." But in his private notes, kept in the locked drawer of his desk, he admitted the terrible truth that haunted him. He had gambled everything on Patton. If Third Army did not break through, Bastogne would fall, the division would be slaughtered, and the blame in his mind and in the eyes of history would rest squarely on the man who had authorized the attempt. Then on the 23rd of December, a miracle occurred. The sky over Bastogne, which had been a suffocating lid of gray fog for weeks, finally cleared. The roar of engines filled the air as C-47 transport planes roared in at low altitude. Their cargo doors open, dropping hundreds of bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Paratroopers looked up from their foxholes and watched the parachutes bloom above them, like slow-motion salvation, realizing they had not been forgotten. It bought them time, precious hours of resistance. But it was not deliverance. German commanders, furious at the stubborn American resistance and the sudden resupply, prepared even more savage attacks, driven by Adolf Hitler's direct order that Bastogne must be taken at any cost. Hitler saw the town not just as a tactical objective, but as a symbol. Crushing the elite American paratroopers there would prove to the world that Germany could still strike fear into Allied hearts. Eisenhower sensed the shifting momentum and sent urgent, almost frantic messages to Patton. "George, I need maximum effort. The 101st cannot hold much longer. Whatever you are doing, do it faster." On paper, such words are just ink, but in reality, they carried the crushing weight of thousands of shivering, hungry, exhausted men who were dying while waiting for the sound of friendly tanks. By Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, Eisenhower looked years older than he had a week before, his face gray and drawn. He attended a chapel service, trying for a few minutes to close his eyes and listen to words of peace. But his mind refused to rest, knowing that men under his command were fighting and dying in the snow. At that very moment, between hymns, he kept glancing toward the door, waiting for an aide to enter with updates, his heart pounding with every footstep in the hallway. Reports from Patton's spearheads were cautiously optimistic, claiming they were fighting closer, but the hard truth remained. Bastogne was still encircled, and the corridor was not open. That night, in the solitude of his office, Eisenhower sat at his desk and began a task that tore at his soul, drafting letters he prayed he would never have to send. These were conditional letters prepared in case of the worst, letters to the families of men in the 101st whom he had spoken to personally, to chaplains, and to staff officers who had sons in the division. One aide remembered finding him late that night, surrounded by half-finished condolences, looking up with haunted eyes to say, "I hope to God I do not have to sign these." Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944, should have been a day of carols and candlelight. But for Eisenhower, it was a day of gnawing anxiety. He checked messages during the church service, after lunch, and deep into the night. But there was still no definitive word. Third Army was closing in, grinding forward yard by bloody yard, and the 101st was still holding, but the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Then came the 26th of December. In the late afternoon, at 10 minutes before 5, the telephone on Eisenhower's desk rang with a shrill sound that seemed to stop time. His aide answered, listened for a moment, then turned to his commander with an expression that made everyone in the room freeze in their tracks. "Sir," he said, "it is General Patton. He says it is urgent." Eisenhower snatched up the receiver, his hand trembling slightly. "Ike, we are through." Patton's voice came over the line, carrying the crackle of distance and the immense weight of relief. 4th Armored made contact with the 101st at 1650 hours. The corridor is narrow, but it is open. We are pushing supplies and reinforcements through now. Bastogne is relieved. For a heartbeat, maybe two, Eisenhower said nothing, unable to speak as the tension of the last week released its grip on his chest. The men watching him saw his shoulders sag as if a physical weight, massive and suffocating, had suddenly been lifted. His hand tightened around the phone, knuckles whitening. "George," he said at last, his voice unsteady and thick with emotion, "say that again." "We are through to Bastogne," Patton repeated, savoring the words. "The Screaming Eagles are safe. They are beaten up, but they held. We got there in time." Eisenhower's answer was immediate and raw. "George, I thank God. Thank you. You did it. You saved them." Patton, ever uncomfortable with overt sentiment, tried to deflect the praise, saying, "Just doing my job, Ike. Those paratroopers did the real work. We just opened the door." But Eisenhower would not let him diminish it. "No, George, do not undersell this. You turned an entire army in a blizzard and broke through in 4 days. That is not just doing your job. That is why you are indispensable. Difficult as hell, but indispensable." After the call ended, Eisenhower remained standing, staring at the map where a thin line now connected 3rd Army to Bastogne. Finally breaking the circle of black ink, witnesses later recalled that his eyes were wet, and he did not bother to hide it. "Gentlemen," he said to his staff, his voice regaining its strength, "General Patton has just accomplished something I will remember as long as I live. He saved 10,000 American soldiers who were hours, perhaps minutes, from annihilation." Later that evening, Eisenhower's aide found him alone again, looking at the same map, tracing the new corridor with one finger. He said quietly, almost to himself, 4 more hours. That is all he had. 4 more hours and the 101st would have been overrun. He had made it with 4 hours to spare. 4 hours between salvation and annihilation. In the years that followed, Eisenhower would admit that trusting Patton was his greatest gamble, a wager of 10,000 lives on a wild genius. But when the phone rang that afternoon, he knew he had won. If you were in Eisenhower's shoes, would you have trusted a volatile general like Patton with the lives of 10,000 men? Or would you have played it safe? Let me know your command decision in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.